When Ethan Miller, a farmer from Willow Creek, publicly humiliated his aging mother over a trivial mistake, no one expected what would happen next. But life has a way of delivering lessons in the most unexpected forms. In this case, it came through Max, a loyal French bulldog whose actions would not only open Ethan's eyes but also change the entire family forever. This is a powerful story about respect, love, and the silent ways animals can bring out the best in us. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it so more people can discover moving stories like this one. Turn on notifications so you never miss our next heartfelt tale. The Willow Creek Farmers Market was bustling on that crisp Saturday morning. Stalls brimmed with fresh produce, the scent of baked bread and honey-roasted nuts filling the air. Ethan Miller's booth stood out, not only for its abundance of vegetables, but also for the proud sign bearing the family name, Miller's Harvest, since 1952. His mother, Margaret Miller, had been the heart of that brand for decades. She was there that morning, moving more slowly than she used to, her hands arthritic but still deft as they arranged carrots into neat rows. Customers who had known her for years smiled warmly, but Ethan seemed impatient, his eyes scanning for every small imperfection. He had taken over most of the farm's operations recently, and his drive to make things perfect often crossed the line into harshness. The incident began when Margaret accidentally gave a regular customer, Mrs. Porter, too much change. Mrs. Porter, sweetly trying to correct the mistake, handed the bills back. But before Margaret could respond, Ethan snapped. "Mom, can you please pay attention? This isn't hard," he said sharply, his voice loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. Margaret's cheeks flushed. She tried to laugh it off, but the sting was clear. "You can't just hand out money like candy," Ethan continued, shaking his head. "This is why I've been handling the register myself. We can't afford sloppy mistakes." The words hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Porter looked uncomfortable, murmuring something about how everyone makes mistakes. A couple of other shoppers shifted awkwardly, pretending to browse. What Ethan didn't notice, at least not yet, was the small cream-colored French bulldog sitting quietly under the table, watching everything. His name was Max. He wasn't Margaret's dog by blood. He'd been a stray that wandered onto the farm a few months ago, muddy and hungry, before Margaret took him in. But from that first day, Max had become her shadow, following her everywhere with a mix of devotion and protectiveness that no one could quite explain. Max's eyes followed Margaret as she lowered her gaze, her hands fumbling slightly as she returned to arranging the carrots. To anyone watching closely, the little bulldog's posture changed. Ears twitching, eyes narrowing, body leaning forward as if sensing her distress. The morning carried on, but the market's cheerful hum seemed quieter around the miller's stall. Ethan, still annoyed, muttered to himself as he restocked crates. Margaret remained silent, her usual soft chatter with customers replaced by a quiet efficiency. Later that afternoon, as they packed up, Margaret's hands trembled slightly. Not from the cold, but from the sting of humiliation. Ethan noticed but said nothing. Max, however, stayed pressed against her leg the entire time, occasionally glancing up at her with eyes that seemed to say what Ethan couldn't, or wouldn't, yet admit, that he'd gone too far. That night, after the produce was unloaded back at the farm, Margaret lingered in the barn, stroking Max's head. "You're the only gentleman around here, aren't you?" she whispered. Max's short tail wiggled in response. Neither of them knew it yet, but the events of that day would set in motion a chain of moments that would forever change Ethan's understanding of respect, family, and the quiet but powerful ways a dog can teach a human the most important lessons of all. The following week at Miller's Harvest was quieter than usual. Margaret still rose before dawn, her steps deliberate as she made her way to the kitchen to start the day's baking. The smell of her cinnamon rolls, once the pride of the farmer's market, filled the air. Ethan entered the room without so much as a good morning, instead scrolling through his phone, eyes flicking at the day's sales goals and inventory notes. Margaret slid a tray of steaming rolls onto the table. "Fresh for the market," she said softly, setting out plates. "They look fine," Ethan replied without looking up, his tone clipped. But we can't keep making these unless they turn a better profit. I'll run the numbers later. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't argue. She never did anymore. Under the table, Max was curled at her feet, his head resting lightly on her slippers. His round, dark eyes flicked from Ethan to Margaret, sensing the tension hanging between them like thick fog. The French Bulldog had been a street survivor before finding the Millers. A dog who understood hunger, cold nights, and the absence of kindness. Perhaps that's why the sharpness in Ethan's voice didn't sit well with him. The morning passed in a rush of chores. Ethan loaded crates of lettuce and onions into the truck while Margaret carefully wrapped jars of jam in old newspaper. Max followed her every move, occasionally nudging her leg as if to remind her he was there. At the market, business was brisk. But trouble came when a heavy rain cloud rolled in, soaking the ground within minutes. Customers huddled under umbrellas. Ethan barked orders about covering the produce, securing the tent, and moving displays inside the stall. Margaret was lifting a crate of apples when her foot slipped on the wet pavement. The apples tumbled, rolling across the ground, splashing in small puddles. She let out a soft gasp, embarrassed. "Oh, for crying out loud, Mom," Ethan said loudly, grabbing the crate from her hands. "Why didn't you watch where you were going? Now we'll have bruised stock we can't sell." It wasn't the words alone. It was the way they landed, sharp and public. Margaret's shoulders sank. She knelt, gathering the apples, and it was then that Max made his move. The little bulldog trotted out from under the stall, planting himself between Ethan and Margaret. His squat body was sturdy, and his stance, head high, chest out, spoke volumes. He didn't growl, but his eyes locked on Ethan's with an intensity that caught him off guard. "What's his problem?" Ethan muttered, taking a step back. Max didn't move. Instead, he turned his head toward Margaret and then back to Ethan, as if to say, "She's with me." Margaret reached down, brushing Max's ear gently. "It's okay, boy," she murmured. But her voice carried more emotion than she intended. Customers nearby smiled faintly, some even chuckling at the dog's protective stance. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't like being made to look foolish, least of all by a dog. The rest of the day passed with an awkward quiet between them. Ethan worked quickly, avoiding conversation, while Margaret focused on tending customers. Max stayed glued to her side, his watchful eyes never leaving her. That night, as Ethan unloaded the truck, he caught sight of Margaret and Max sitting on the porch swing. The dog's head rested on her lap, and she was speaking to him in a low, soothing voice. Ethan couldn't make out the words, but something about the scene. A woman and her dog sharing a quiet moment after a long, damp day stirred something unfamiliar in him. He brushed it off, telling himself it was nothing. But Max, in his own quiet way, had drawn the first line in a battle Ethan didn't yet know he was fighting. The storm that soaked the market left more than muddy tire tracks and bruised apples. It seemed to linger in the house itself, a damp heaviness that settled into the corners of the Miller farmhouse. The following morning, Ethan paced the kitchen like a man looking for something he'd lost but couldn't name. He rattled off numbers to no one. Losses from damaged produce, the cost of a new canopy, whether the cinnamon rolls were worth the time anymore. Margaret listened quietly at the sink, hands in warm, soapy water, washing the last of the baking trays. Max lay at her feet, chin on his paws, eyes tracking Ethan's every step. "We need a wholesale deal," Ethan said finally, as if making a proclamation. "Not just the market. I've got a meeting with a distributor out near the highway this afternoon. If we land it, we can skip the small stuff that slows us down." "Small stuff?" Margaret repeated, turning off the faucet. She dried her hands slowly. "You mean people. Customers are fine, Mom, but we're not a charity. We have to grow or we'll die." She didn't argue, but the line dug into him anyway. Max rose, trotted to the door, and scratched. Margaret took it as a cue. "I'll be in the west field pulling the last of the kale before it bolts," she said, slipping on her jacket. "Shout if you need me." Ethan didn't shout. He just nodded, already opening a notebook to draft numbers he hoped would impress the distributor. When the screen door snapped shut behind her, he exhaled and tried to focus. The day warmed quickly, and by mid-morning the sun pressed down on Willow Creek with a dry insistence. In the field, the kale leaves shimmered a dusty green, their edges curled from yesterday's wind. Margaret knelt among the rows with a basket beside her, wearing the straw hat Ethan always said made her look like a photograph from the farm's earliest days. Max patrolled the edges of the beds, sniffing, listening, then returned to plant himself in the shade of the basket, panting softly. After an hour, Margaret paused to rub her shoulder. The arthritis had been louder lately. She flexed her fingers, shook them out, and reached for the next plant. Max watched, brow furrowing in that concerned way of his. She smiled down at him. "Almost done, Captain," she said, using the nickname she'd given him the first week he arrived, when he'd marched around the porch as if inspecting a ship. Back at the house, Ethan's phone buzzed with a text from the distributor. "Running early. Can you meet in 30 minutes? A cold thrill of opportunity shot through him. This could turn the farm around, justify every hard choice, every sharp word. He grabbed his keys, then hesitated. The West Field. His mother. The sun was harsher than he'd realized. He stepped onto the porch and called across the pasture. No answer. The wind carried his voice back to him, thin and useless. "Mom!" He tried again, louder. Silence. Just as he was about to head for the truck anyway, something cream-colored tore across the yard. A low, muscular blur with ears pinned and eyes blazing. Max bounded up the steps and slammed into Ethan's shins, then spun and sprinted back toward the field. He stopped, looked over his shoulder, barked once, and bolted again. "Hey!" Ethan shouted, startled. The dog was insistent, urgent in a way Ethan had never seen. He glanced at his buzzing phone, then at the field. "All right, I'm coming." He followed the Bulldog through the gate and down the worn path, boots crushing dry clover. As the rows came into view, the heat rose off the soil in wavering sheets. Max veered left, then right, pacing a frantic zigzag until he reached a patch of crushed leaves. There, just beyond the basket, Margaret was sitting on the ground, one hand braced on the dirt, the other pressed to her shoulder. She wasn't unconscious, but her face was pale and tight. "Mom," Ethan said, dropping to a knee. "What happened?" She tried to smile and failed. "Just a spell. Got dizzy. I was going to call you, and then I must have." Sat down instead. She looked past him to Max. He ran like a rocket. Ethan swallowed a knot of fear he didn't want to name. "You should have told me you weren't feeling well." "I tell you plenty," she said gently. "You don't always hear." The truth stung precisely because it landed softly. Max pressed his body against her leg and looked up at Ethan as if issuing orders. "Fix this." "We're going inside," Ethan said. "Distributor can wait." They moved slowly, with Max walking backward half the time as if shepherding them home. In the kitchen, Ethan made her sit and drink water while he dialed the clinic. It wasn't an emergency, the nurse said, but they could check her blood pressure that afternoon. He booked it. The distributor texted again. 5 minutes out. "Should we meet at the stand?" Ethan stared at the message. His thumbs hovered. He looked at his mother, small in the chair but somehow steadying the whole room, and at the Bulldog who refused to leave her side. He typed. Something came up. "Can we reschedule? Family matter." The reply took a minute that felt like 10. "Understood." "Tomorrow?" He exhaled. "Tomorrow." While Margaret rested, Ethan stepped onto the porch with Max. The dog went straight to the porch swing, where he and Margaret had sat the night before, and hopped up, planting himself like a sentinel. Ethan sank into the opposite end. For a moment neither moved, both listening to the slow rhythm of the house. "You knew," Ethan said finally, more to himself than to the dog. "You knew I was about to blow past it." Max tilted his head, the heavy folds of his face arranged in a patient, worried map. He didn't wag. He didn't beg. He simply stayed, the one thing Ethan hadn't been doing. The afternoon cooled, and with it, Ethan's defenses. He thought about the market, the apples in the puddles, the way the customers averted their eyes, the way his mother's hands shook afterward. He thought about the little bulldog stepping between them, taking the heat of Ethan's gaze and returning it without flinching. And today, the sprint, the bark, the demand that he really look at the person who had built the thing he was trying so hard to scale. Margaret appeared in the doorway, color back in her cheeks. "Nurse says I'm fine," she reported. "Just overdid it. Imagine that." Ethan stood, throat thick. "I'm sorry," he said, the words unfamiliar but right. "For the market. For today. For not hearing." She studied him for a long beat, then nodded once. "Thank you." She scratched Max behind his ear. "You too, Captain." The screen door swung shut again, leaving Ethan and the bulldog on the porch with the lengthening shadows. Somewhere down the road, a truck rumbled past. Somewhere in his pocket, his phone buzzed with a notification he didn't check. "Tomorrow," he said to Max. "I'll meet them tomorrow." Max blinked, then, as if satisfied, slid down and pressed his warm weight against Ethan's boot. But as the light thinned, a dust cloud rose on the lane, a county vehicle easing toward the farmhouse. The emblem on the door caught the sun. Agricultural Health and Inspection. Ethan's stomach tightened. Had someone reported the market incident? Was there a complaint about food safety after the storm? The car stopped. A clipboard inspector stepped out and waved. "Afternoon," she called. "We received a note about conditions at Miller's Harvest. Just a routine visit." Routine. The word rang hollow. Ethan looked at the kitchen window, where his mother stood just out of sight, and at Max, already on his feet again, ears high, eyes bright. He squared his shoulders, unsure if the farm, or the fragile piece he'd just found, was about to be tested all over again. Would the next hour undo everything they'd repaired, or prove, finally, that he was capable of learning the lesson the bulldog had been trying to teach him all along? The air between Ethan and the inspector felt charged, as though the warm wind had shifted to carry something heavier. The woman in the county-issued polo stepped onto the porch, clipboard tucked under her arm, and extended her hand. "Mr. Miller? I'm Janet Carter, Agricultural Health and Inspection. This shouldn't take long. Just need to check a few things." Ethan shook her hand, masking the unease building in his stomach. "Of course. Can I ask what prompted the visit?" She smiled politely, the kind of smile that revealed nothing. "We received an anonymous tip about potential safety issues at your stall and storage area. Could be nothing, but we're required to follow up." Max stood at Ethan's side, his body a wall of alert muscle. The bulldog's steady gaze tracked Janet's every step, not in hostility but in a quiet readiness, as though he'd already assessed that this conversation mattered. Margaret came to the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Everything all right?" "Just an inspection," Ethan replied quickly. He didn't want her worried, not after this morning. "Shouldn't be an issue." Janet's pen was already moving across her checklist. "I'll need to see your cold storage, dry goods, and the produce prep area. Also, where the animals are kept, if any." Ethan gestured toward the back of the property. "This way." He led her past the west field where the kale still stood in neat rows, then toward the small storage shed they used for packing orders. The building smelled faintly of earth and apples, and for a second he thought it looked fine. Clean enough. But Janet's eyes were sharp. She noticed the uneven floorboards near the cooler, the open grain sack in the corner where mice could slip in, the hose left coiled on the floor instead of mounted. "These are minor," she said, making notes. "But they'll need attention before my next visit." Ethan nodded, heat creeping up his neck. It wasn't that he'd been careless, just distracted, always rushing to the next task, the next opportunity, convinced that momentum was enough to keep the farm alive. They moved on to the outdoor prep table. A few damp crates sat stacked near the side, left over from the storm. Janet crouched to inspect them. "You'll want to scrub these down with a proper sanitizer. Stormwater can carry a lot you don't want near produce." Margaret's voice came from behind them. "I told him as much yesterday." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. His mother wasn't scolding, just stating a fact. But the reminder hit like a quiet echo of every time he'd brushed off her advice. They finished in the storage area and headed back toward the porch. Max kept pace at Ethan's side, occasionally trotting ahead, as if ensuring the path was clear. When they reached the steps, Janet paused. "Overall, nothing critical," she said. "But there's a gap between not in trouble and thriving. You're running a farm, Mr. Miller, not just surviving one. That means being proactive, not reactive." The words landed harder than Ethan expected. Proactive, not reactive. It was exactly what Max had done this morning. Seeing trouble, acting fast, not waiting for someone else to notice. Janet handed him a carbon copy of her notes. "I'll be back in 2 weeks. Clean up these points, and you'll be in good standing." "Thank you," Ethan said, and meant it. After she left, Ethan stood on the porch, looking out over the fields. The sun was lowering, painting everything in warm amber. Margaret had gone back inside, but her shadow lingered in the kitchen window. Max sat beside him, panting softly. "You don't just react, do you?" Ethan murmured to the dog. "You watch, you think, then you move." The bulldog tilted his head, as if to say exactly. Ethan thought about the last few months, the push for bigger deals, the constant rushing, the way he'd ignored the small cracks until they widened. Maybe it was time to do more than just put out fires. Inside, he could hear his mother setting the table. He took a deep breath, feeling something shift, small, but real. Tomorrow, he'd start by fixing the cooler boards, mounting the hose, and scrubbing every crate until they shone. Not because the inspector was coming back, because Max had shown him what it meant to protect what mattered before it was too late. But as he reached for the door, his phone buzzed again. The distributor. Still good for tomorrow? Ethan glanced at Max, then at the farmhouse, then typed back. "Yes, but we do it my way." What he didn't realize was that the biggest test was still ahead. One that would force him to choose between the deal he'd been chasing and the very farm Max had just taught him to guard. The next morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of early light that made the dew sparkle on every blade of grass. Ethan woke earlier than usual, the restlessness from yesterday's inspection still hanging over him. Max had been curled up at the foot of the bed, and the moment Ethan swung his legs to the floor, the bulldog hopped down too, ready to follow. In the kitchen, Margaret was already at the stove, flipping pancakes like she had on countless farm mornings. She didn't look up when she spoke. "You meeting that distributor today?" Ethan poured himself coffee, hesitating. "Yeah, but I told them I have some conditions now." Margaret glanced over her shoulder, one eyebrow raised. "Conditions?" He nodded. "No bulk buyouts that leave us short on the local orders. No deadlines that push us past what we can keep fresh. And they cover transport, our trucks not ready for heavy runs." His mother studied him for a moment, and Ethan could see the surprise in her eyes, mixed with a quiet kind of pride. "Good. Don't sell your soul for quick cash." They ate in comfortable silence, but the decision still weighed heavy in his mind. The deal could change everything: new equipment, debt paid down, stability. But if it was wrong, it could hollow the farm out from the inside. By mid-morning, the distributor's truck pulled up, a sleek black vehicle that looked almost out of place against the weathered barn. A tall man in a tailored jacket stepped out, Robert Lane. His smile was polished, but his eyes swept over the property like a man appraising an asset. "Ethan, great to finally meet in person," Lane said, shaking his hand. "I'm ready to make this work. Let's finalize." They walked toward the barn, Max shadowing them at a steady pace. Lane barely spared the dog a glance, focused instead on laying out his terms. "We take the majority of your crop, long-term contract, guaranteed payment every month. But to keep up with our volume, you'll need to double output. That means planting faster, harvesting faster. We'll even front you the costs for extra labor." Ethan felt the first red flag in his gut. "And the locals? The restaurants, the market stalls?" Lane's tone was dismissive. "Small potatoes. You won't have time for them if you're meeting our deadlines. This is about scaling, Ethan. Real money." Max stopped walking, planting himself between the two men. It was subtle, but Ethan noticed. The bulldog's head was low, eyes locked on Lane, ears just slightly back. A silent signal that something was off. Ethan thought about the inspection, about Janet's warning to be proactive. He thought about the late nights his mother had spent packaging boxes for the market, the customers who knew them by name, the quiet trust built over years. And then he thought about what Max had done at the barn the other day, acting fast, without hesitation, to protect what mattered. Ethan stopped walking too. I appreciate the offer, Robert, but I can't do it. Not if it means giving up the relationships that keep this place alive. Lane's smile faded. You're making a mistake. Opportunities like this don't come twice. Ethan shook his head. Maybe, but losing the soul of the farm? That's a mistake I'd never come back from. Max stepped forward, as if sealing the moment. Lane stared at him for a long second, then shrugged. Your choice. He turned, walking briskly to his truck, the deal evaporating into the dust behind him. Ethan stood still, watching the vehicle disappear down the dirt road. The sun was warm on his shoulders, but there was a knot in his chest, part fear, part relief. Margaret stepped out onto the porch. Well, it's over, Ethan said simply. But we'll be fine. He glanced down at Max. We've got what we need. What Ethan didn't know was that the choice he made today wouldn't just protect the farm. It would set the stage for an even bigger test, one that would demand every ounce of trust between him and the bulldog who had already changed his life. The week after Ethan turned down the distributor's offer began with a strange calm. The air felt heavy, like the sky was holding its breath. Farmers in the area murmured about an incoming storm, the kind that didn't just water crops but flattened them. By Wednesday afternoon, dark clouds gathered like an army on the horizon. The wind picked up, rattling the old barn doors and sending loose straw skittering across the yard. Max paced the porch, ears twitching, glancing between Ethan and the sky as though he could smell the trouble rolling in. Ethan, Margaret called from the barn. The north fence is loose again. If it gives, the calves will get out. He was already pulling on his rain jacket. Max, with me. They jogged to the pasture, the wind pushing hard against them. Ethan could feel the temperature drop fast, the smell of wet earth rising even before the rain hit. When they reached the fence, he saw the problem, 2 posts leaning, one already splintered. The cattle inside were restless, their eyes wide in the shifting air. Hold steady, Ethan muttered, grabbing tools from the side shed. Max planted himself nearby, watching the herd, every muscle alert. And then the sky split. Lightning flashed so bright it lit the entire field for a heartbeat, followed by thunder that shook the ground. The cattle bolted toward the far end of the pasture, one calf slipping through the gap in the fence. Max, go! Ethan shouted. The bulldog shot forward, low and fast despite the mud. The calf was spooked, stumbling toward the open field beyond, where a drainage ditch ran deep and fast from the early rain. Max darted ahead, cutting the calf off with a sharp bark, nudging it back toward the pasture. Ethan dropped to his knees, hammering the post into place while rain pelted down so hard it stung. The wind howled, bending the trees, and for a moment he thought they might lose both the fence and the calf. But Max held his ground, circling the young animal, driving it step by step until Ethan could grab the halter rope. Got you? Ethan breathed, pulling the calf inside and securing the gate. Max was soaked, his short coat plastered to his skin, but his eyes were bright and locked on Ethan like he was making sure the job was done. They stumbled back toward the barn, fighting the wind. Inside, Margaret had already secured the stalls, her hair damp under her headscarf. She reached for the calf's rope and looked at Ethan, then down at Max. That dog, she started, but her voice caught. She just shook her head, smiling through the worry. We'd have lost the little one without him. The storm raged for hours, tearing branches down and flooding the far end of the property. But inside the barn, huddled together with the animals safe, Ethan realized something. Turning down Lane's offer hadn't just saved the farm's values. It had kept them nimble, free to handle challenges like this without being chained to someone else's deadlines. When the winds finally eased and the rain softened to a steady patter, Max curled up by Ethan's boots, head resting on his paw. Ethan reached down, scratching behind his ears. "You're more than just a good dog, Max," he said softly. "You're part of the reason we'll make it through anything." What none of them knew was that the storm had set off a chain of events beyond the farm. By the next morning, the decision Ethan had made, and the Bulldog's role in that night, would spread beyond their little town, attracting attention neither of them had ever expected. The morning after the storm, the farm smelled of wet hay and turned earth. The air was sharp and clean, the way it gets after the sky empties everything it has. Ethan was walking the fence line with Max trotting alongside, checking for damage, when he heard a car crunch down the gravel driveway. It wasn't common to get visitors this early, and when he stepped into view, he saw a silver SUV pulling up near the barn. Out stepped a tall man in a weatherproof jacket, followed by a woman carrying a large camera. "Morning," Ethan called cautiously. The man smiled, extending a hand. "I'm Daniel Briggs, local news reporter. This is my colleague, Lila. We heard about what happened last night. About the fence, the calf, and your bulldog here." Ethan blinked. "Heard? From who?" Margaret appeared in the barn doorway holding a coffee mug. "That would be me," she said with a sly smile. "People need to know what kind of dog you've got." The camera clicked as Lila crouched to get a shot of Max, who seemed to know he was the center of attention, sitting tall with his chest puffed out. They spent the morning talking. Ethan recounted the storm, how Max had stopped the calf from bolting into danger, and even how the fence had nearly given out. Lila captured photos of Max in the pasture, by the barn, and even resting his head on Ethan's knee. That night, the story aired on the local news. French Bulldog saves calf during violent storm. Farmer credits his dog with protecting the herd. The segment was short, but it hit a nerve with viewers. Within hours, Ethan's phone lit up with messages from neighbors, friends, and strangers offering congratulations. The next day, an animal welfare group reached out, asking if they could feature Max in a campaign promoting the intelligence and courage of dogs like him. They offered to sponsor veterinary care for Max and help with supplies for the farm. Lane, the distributor Ethan had turned down, even called again, not with another offer to buy him out, but with an apology. "I misjudged you," he admitted. "You've got something worth more than a business deal." But the real change came in Ethan himself. He realized that the lesson Max had taught wasn't just about loyalty or quick thinking. It was about knowing your values and standing by them, even when it's tempting to take the easy road. One evening, about a week after the storm, Ethan was repairing a section of the barn roof. Max sat below, watching the sunset over the fields. Margaret joined them, leaning on the fence. "Funny, isn't it?" she said softly. "How a dog can change the way people see you, and even the way you see yourself." Ethan nodded. "He didn't just save the calf. He reminded me why this farm matters." The camera crews eventually stopped coming. The news cycle moved on, and life on the farm returned to its steady rhythm. But every now and then, Ethan would spot a family driving slowly past the property, kids pointing excitedly toward the pasture. They weren't just looking for cows. They were looking for the little cream-colored bulldog who'd proven that courage doesn't depend on size, and that some lessons in life are best taught without words. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who loves inspiring stories. Together, we can spread the message that loyalty, courage, and standing by your values will always leave a lasting mark, just like Max did.